On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast, foreclosures and evictions are set to resume. So welcome back to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. My name is Sean Yesner, owner and founder of Yesner Law, and this week is another topic that I've talked about a lot in the last few weeks, but I thought that it would be appropriate for today because as I record this, we're at the very end of July of 2021, and all of the foreclosure and eviction moratoriums are set to expire on July 31. So as I record at the end of the week, all the foreclosure and eviction moratoriums are set to expire. So I wanted to dedicate one last episode, I guess, unless it's extended again, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to dedicate one more episode to the eviction and foreclosure moratorium and what should you do if you're a borrower who's behind on your mortgage? What should you do if you're a tenant who's been unable to pay rent? What should you do if you're a landlord that hasn't been receiving rent from your tenant? So I wanted to cover all of those topics today. Now, before I get too deep into the topics, I wanted to talk again about my sponsor, Sam Cohen, a great supporter of the show, great friend of the show. Those of you that have been longtime listeners know that Sam provides E&O insurance, errors and omissions insurance, also called malpractice insurance, to attorneys and title companies all over the country. He's focusing on Texas and Florida right now, but he can write or find you an agent almost anywhere. So a great referral, a great way to support the show would be to support our sponsors so that we can keep these episodes coming to you. And a great way would be to introduce Sam to an attorney or a title company you know whose malpractice insurance is set to expire or set to renew. And an attorney or title company in Texas or Florida would be a great introduction. You can reach Sam at his email, which is sam@attorneysfirst.com, or you can reach him at his website, which is attorneysfirst.com. So we've had this ban on evictions and evictions and foreclosures, this moratorium on evictions and foreclosures for quite a while, and it's been extended time and time and time again, something that I've called kick the can economics. And part of the reason I've been so critical, I genuinely feel for tenants and mortgage borrowers who have been impacted by COVID and unable to pay their rent or unable to pay their mortgage. And the purpose of the law firm really is to help those people. However, I also think there's a large segment of people that are taking advantage and are not paying their mortgage and are not paying their rent because these moratoriums are in place. Now, if you've been impacted by COVID and it's genuinely impacted your ability to pay your mortgage payment and your rent payment, reach out. Let me see if I can help you. There are a bunch of things that I'm going to talk about here that will help you, and I can help you with that. If you're simply taking advantage and sitting back and saying, well, there's a moratorium in place, so I'll deal with it when the moratorium expires, well, it's almost going to be time to pay the piper here in a few days. So what I wanted to do was go over what I've been seeing. Now, I did a search before I started recording today's episode, and I just typed in eviction moratorium. Now, everything that I see, every news article that I see, talks about there will be no more extensions after July 31. It will not be extended again. And this is interesting because we now have the Delta variant of COVID, and cases are spiking here in Florida and I think all over. So my question is, will the CDC, will the federal government extend one more time because we've had a spike in cases? Now, interestingly, I also looked at the data provided by the state of Florida, and although we've had a spike in cases, we really haven't had a spike in deaths, which is a good thing, I think, because I think what that means is that while the Delta variant is more contagious and people are still dying from COVID, I don't want to lessen that, but while the Delta variant is more contagious and more people are getting COVID, it would appear from the data that I've seen from the state of Florida that less people are dying from it, less people are being hospitalized because of it, more people are vaccinated, so COVID is not hitting them as hard. It's more just the equivalent of feeling like you got hit by a truck, feeling like you've got a nasty case of the flu. And I've been very careful to not analogize COVID with the flu, but that's what I'm hearing from people who have been vaccinated and still caught COVID, or people who have not been vaccinated and have caught COVID. I certainly know people that have been in the hospital because of it. I don't know personally anyone who's passed from it, luckily, but I know people do. So, I don't know what the impact of the spike in cases is going to have on the moratorium, but the last CDC extension to July 31, the CDC actually came out and said it was intended to be the last extension. So at least as far as what the CDC has put out, there will be no more extensions beyond July 31. Looking at some of the headlines, so for example, CBS had a headline that said, with evictions set to restart, housing advocates fear another coronavirus wave. Sort of like what I was saying. Will the spike in cases extend the moratorium one more time? CBS seems to believe, based on housing advocates, that there may be a possibility of extending it one more time. It would appear from the headline. The Los Angeles Daily News: why unprecedented spike in evictions is expected as federal moratorium expires. Again, both of these articles confirm the fact that the CDC is not going to extend, or at least has said it's not going to extend the moratorium, but both also are concerned about the spike in cases and what impact that might have on evictions. And finally, the Miami Herald: Avalanche, Miami renters brace for mass evictions as moratorium ends. Again, a recognition that the CDC has said they're not going to extend the moratorium on evictions. So what should you do if you're a tenant? Well, there is rental assistance available. You have to apply through the state. You can get rental assistance, and then you can pay it to your landlord. You should also reach out to your landlord. You should also talk to your landlord about what's going on and what can you pay and how much can you pay. Now, remember, this all only applies to residential evictions. If you're a commercial tenant, if you've got a business that's renting space and your business is suffering because of COVID, these eviction moratoriums do not apply to you. They only apply in residential settings. So reach out to your landlord. The CDC has an affidavit. You can go to the CDC website. You can find it on Google pretty easy. The CDC has an affidavit that you can file with your landlord, and if you are being sued for eviction, you file it with the court. And if you meet the criteria of the CDC affidavit, then the eviction cannot proceed. Now, I can tell you on behalf of landlords, I have overcome the tenants' affirmations in the CDC affidavit because they're either not applying for federal assistance or not paying as much as they can or not looking for a job or something along those lines. We've been able to overcome the CDC affidavit for landlords in a couple of different scenarios. If you are a tenant, I would fill out the CDC affidavit, but I would also try to find a job if you're not looking, or maybe a second job, or maybe a side hustle, or something that can bring in some additional revenue. Now, again, I know it's easier said than done, and if you're a tenant and if you're in a bad position because you've lost your job, I genuinely feel for you. Please reach out to me and let's figure out maybe some things that you can do to try to protect yourself and your family. If you're a landlord, work with these people. Work with the tenants that are willing to work with you. Because, while we can overcome the CDC affidavit and we can evict people, and judges are doing it, I can tell you it doesn't really make anybody happy to throw somebody out of their home. Now, I get it, landlords. You have a mortgage that you've got to pay. You've got expenses that you've got to pay. And you rely on the rent that you get from tenants to do these things. Completely understand, and I completely get it. At the same time, as a landlord, if you're living rent check to rent check, if you're relying on that rent check, if you don't have a little bit of a surplus or a war chest built up, you may have some other issues there. At the same time, make sure you're screening your tenants. Make sure you're screening your tenants properly so that you get somebody that you believe will not take advantage of the system. Make sure that you get somebody that's got a fairly stable job and fairly stable income. Double check to see if they've been evicted before. All these upfront due diligence things may be able to avoid some of this stuff down the road. I used to say that given the decline in COVID cases, for a tenant to argue today that COVID has impacted their ability to work and their impact to make money and their impact to pay rent has been significantly lessened because of the drop in cases. But again, because the increase in cases recently, I don't know how accurate that is to say anymore. I don't know if a landlord could actually make that claim that there's been a decline in cases and so COVID should not impact a tenant's ability to work and make money and pay, because now we've had a spike in cases. So again, it'll be interesting to see here over the next couple of days. Will the CDC, will the government extend the eviction moratorium because of the spike in cases? Or were they truthful? Were they accurate when they said in the last extension that this is intended to be the last extension? I guess time will tell and we will see. But again, if you're a tenant and you're having issues paying because you've lost your job due to COVID, or you got sick and couldn't work, or you got laid off or whatever, and you're in the state of Florida, go ahead and reach out to us and we'll definitely see if we can help you. If you're a landlord, work with your tenants. Now, I get it. If you're not paying rent, if they're not paying rent, you really only have one option, which is to evict. But again, work with them. Make sure that you're being fair. And I get it. You've got your mortgage to pay. You've got your expenses to pay. But, again, there's something to be said for let's all be nice to each other and let's all work together. Ultimately, the contract and the law have to control. Ultimately, if the tenant's not paying rent, they should be evicted. But I don't think it takes a lot of effort or energy, and it's probably just the right thing to do from a karma perspective to pick up the phone and talk. Talk to your landlord, talk to your tenant, see if there's something that can be worked out. If not, that's what we're here for. We can help represent landlords. We can help represent tenants. We can help navigate through the CDC moratorium. We can help navigate through the CDC affidavit. So please reach out to us if you have any questions. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the foreclosure moratorium. Now, the foreclosure moratorium is a little bit more difficult. It is also set to expire on July 31, here in a few days. However, the foreclosure moratorium has some other factors that are coming into play here. So, for example, the foreclosure moratorium only applies to federally backed loans. So we're talking about loans that are backed by the USDA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the FHA, HUD, the VA, those types of organizations. If you borrowed money from a hard money lender, from a private lender, from a subprime lender, from anybody other than a USDA, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, HUD, VA backed loan, if you have a loan other than that, then the foreclosure moratorium doesn't apply to you. I just had a mediation yesterday with a hard money lender, and the foreclosure was proceeding because hard money lenders are not governed by these moratoriums and these rules. Only the federally backed stuff is governed by these rules. Now, some states also have foreclosure moratoriums in place. And going back to evictions for a second, some states have eviction moratoriums in place beyond what the CDC put in place. So if you're outside the state of Florida, definitely check with a local attorney. Definitely check with the laws in your states to see if the eviction or foreclosure moratorium will extend by state law beyond July 31. I can tell you in Florida, it does not. So Florida does not have a separate eviction moratorium or a separate foreclosure moratorium that would extend evictions and foreclosures beyond July 31. But if you're outside the state of Florida, definitely check either with a local attorney or with the laws in your state. The other thing that we have governing mortgages is the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, remember, the CFPB was put in place after the foreclosure meltdown that we had from 2008 to 2014-ish. And the role of the CFPB is exactly what it sounds like, consumer protection, specifically related to mortgages. Now, the CFPB has put some other guidelines in place in connection with mortgage foreclosures. So first, the mortgage has to be more than 120 days behind. So before the bank can foreclose, the mortgage has to be at least 4 months behind. Now, during that 4-month period of time, the bank must offer loss mitigation applications. So in other words, the bank has to reach out and try to work with a borrower that is behind during that 120-day period. The mortgage servicer needs to confirm that the home is abandoned if they want to foreclose. So if it's someone who's passed away, if it's someone who's just simply given up and moved out, something like that, the mortgage servicer needs to confirm that the house is abandoned before they can file any kind of foreclosure case. And the servicer must make reasonable efforts to contact the borrower within that 120-day period for borrowers that are 120 days behind, and the homeowner has to be unresponsive for 90 days. So if the servicer cannot confirm that the house is abandoned, but the homeowner's unresponsive for 90 days, then the mortgage servicer can still foreclose. So what does this mean? Well, right now we've got a eviction or a foreclosure, moratorium until July 31. So on August 1, the bank can look at loans that are more than 4 months behind, more than 120 days behind. What they need to do is take the next 120 days to try to put a loss mitigation plan in place. And I'll talk about what those are in a minute. So you got 4 months starting on August 1. So August, September, October, November. So the foreclosure can't start until at least December 1. And then what they also have to do is they have to make sure that the borrower is unresponsive or does not modify the loan within 90 days. So what that looks like is we're really not going to have a lot of foreclosures filed until early 2022 at a minimum. And again, this only applies to federally backed. So USDA, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, HUD, VA. Now, some other lenders, some subprime lenders may incorporate these guidelines and use them before starting on a foreclosure, but it's not required. It's only required for the federally backed stuff. So even though the moratorium may end here this weekend, it's still going to be, I think, until the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022 before a lot of foreclosures are filed. Now, what I think is going to happen is the first wave of cases that the banks are going to address are all of those people that were in foreclosure March of 2020 when the country shut down. Those are going to be the first ones that they pick up and move forward once the moratorium is lifted. Then they're going to get to the defaults that occurred in April and May and June, summertime of 2020. Then they're going to get to the defaults that occurred in fall of 2020. Then they're going to get to the defaults that occurred in early 2021. And I think the reason the banks are going to do this is they don't want to flood the market with inventory, even though there's a lack of inventory, or more accurately, as soon as something hits the market, it sells really quick. I think the banks are not still going to want to flood the market with inventory. So I think they're going to do this relatively slowly. Now, again, that doesn't mean that if you're in default because you didn't make your mortgage payment starting in April of 2020, that does not mean that you're going to be safe until 2023 or 2024. It is entirely possible that you could get a foreclosure notice, here in late 2021 or early 2022. So don't take this podcast as advice that, if you're behind, if you fell behind, this summer, you're safe, because if you fell behind, you need to get the mortgage caught up somehow. Now, what the CFPB has said is that mortgage servicers have to offer you 3 options. Number 1, they have to give you the option to resume payments and take arrears and put them at the end of the loan. Now, this may or may not make sense for somebody that's been behind since March of 2020, because now we're looking at a year and a half of payments that have to be put behind at the end of the loan, rather. So I don't know how that's going to work, but that's one of the things that the banks must or can offer you, is to resume payments, take all the arrears, take all the back payments, and put them at the end of the loan. The other thing the bank can offer is a modification of the length or the interest rate, and potentially both. So they could say, we're going to extend your loan to a 40-year term, and we're going to drop the interest rate to be consistent with what interest rates are right now. And so they could do that, and that will reduce your payments as well. The third thing they can do is offer for you to sell the property. Now, as bad as that sounds, the fact that properties are going up so much in value so quickly, you may have equity in your home where you can cash out and use that money to rent, or cash out and use that money to buy a smaller house for cash. For example, the mediation that I had yesterday, at the time the client came to me, the house had very little equity, maybe $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, had very, very little equity. But when we were at the mediation yesterday and we were looking at the numbers, as of yesterday, the house had nearly $200,000, maybe even close to $300,000 of equity. I had another homeowner who, when they first contacted me, was negative equity. So it was going to be a deficiency if we had to do a foreclosure or a short sale, if we had to do it that way. And today, the borrower has 6 figures of equity. In fact, sold the house, I think, last week and got a check for 6 figures, something north of $100,000. So we went from a negative equity deficit situation to a positive equity surplus situation. So selling the house may not be a bad thing, because you can take that cash and either use it to pay rent and let your credit recover, or maybe use it to downsize, buy a smaller house, buy a more affordable house, something along those lines. And so what I think is, I don't think there's going to be the mass of short sales that we had from 2008 to 2014, 13, 14. I think there's going to be a lot of what I'm calling forced sales. So people that need to sell the house but now find themselves in a position of having equity in the house. So, again, we always also have bankruptcy as a potential option if you find yourself in foreclosure, but that can get difficult. Are we going to do a Chapter 7? Are we going to do a Chapter 13? Can we modify the loan in a Chapter 13? Can we Can we cure the arrears? Now, if you're in default since 2019 or 2020, maybe a Chapter 13 isn't a good idea unless we can modify the loan. If you've just fallen behind in the last few months, maybe a Chapter 13 is a better idea, because there's less to catch up within the Chapter 13 plan. So we've always got some of those more traditional options. Like I said, we had a loan modification mediation yesterday. Those of you that are really long-time listeners know my stance on foreclosure mediations, but yesterday was actually a successful settled mediation, mortgage foreclosure mediation, the second one of my career. Now, I don't know that necessarily speaks to my ability to settle cases. I think it more speaks to the inefficiency of the mortgage foreclosure mediation process. However, the reason we were able to settle yesterday was because we had a private hard money lender who was there literally sitting at the table with us, who had the ability to make decisions sitting there at the table. The other one that I resolved at the table was with a credit union. Again, a decision maker sitting there at the table at mediation. But I digress. So, all of those traditional options are still available. So if you're behind on your mortgage, again, reach out to me. I've been doing this since 2001, both on the plaintiff and the defendant side, both for the banks and for the borrowers. Now, most of my practice, the majority of my practice, focuses on borrowers. So if you're a homeowner and you're in foreclosure or fear that you may be facing foreclosure and you're in the state of Florida, please reach out to me. Let's talk about your options. Let's talk about the different things that we can do to help you save your home. Or if we determine that we can't help you save your home, maybe we can help you sell the home for the maximum amount of equity that you can pull from it. We work with a ton of realtors. We can refer you to realtors all over the state of Florida that can help you sell the house for retail. And maximize the amount that you get for the sale of the house. So, please reach out to me. As I record this and as this episode gets released, we will be a few days from the end of the eviction and foreclosure moratorium. I don't know at the time that I record if either of those will be extended. Everything that I've been reading in the last couple of days points to the fact that they will not be extended, that both the eviction and the foreclosure moratorium will expire July 31 of 2021. So we need to come up with a plan starting on August 1 of how are we going to help you if you're a landlord that has a tenant who's not paying? How are we going to help you if you're a tenant who's been unable to pay? and how are we going to help you if you're a borrower that's in fear of losing the house in foreclosure. So that'll do it for this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, Sean@yesnerlaw.com. I always offer a free consultation, and we can go over all of your options, both traditional and non-traditional options. But that'll do it for this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. I hope that at the end of the month you have more money rather than at the end of the money you have more month. And we look forward to talking to you in next week's episode.